Next, we'll install the Excel Services application. This is probably one of the most straightforward to create. Just a few notes. First, we're going to use the BI Services application pool that we created in the earlier step when we created the Secure Store service. And then subsequent to the configuration, we'll just do a few things. So the first is setting the unattended service account to that account that we created. The service has to be unattended, and this is done within Central Administration. And then in the Trusted Library settings, there are a couple things we need to do. One is increasing the maximum workbook size. The maximum workbook size that's default is pretty small, and it's okay for just regular workbooks, but for something that has BI content, for example, that might be a Power Pivot workbook, that's going to be just too small. So right off the bat, we'll bump that up to some level that we think is reasonable. We'll also turn off refresh warnings, because every time a user opens a workbook and they want to refresh it, we don't want it to pop up and kind of annoy them to let them know that they're going to do a refresh. The second thing is adding the data source library to the trusted data source locations. Excel Services requires that every place we're going to draw a data source from within the SharePoint environment, we need to explicitly call that out. And then we also need to give some permissions to the content database, to the Excel Services service account, which is the service SPBI, because when Excel Services renders something, it needs to be able to go into the content database and pull that out on behalf of the user, and by default it won't actually have permissions to do that. So we'll do that, and I'll do that within Management Studio. This can also be done in PowerShell. Whatever method that you prefer to use, feel free to use that. We'll go back to Central Administration. Again, Application Management, Managed Service Applications. And these are the ones we have now. So we're going to go ahead and create a new Excel Services application. Pretty much follow through the menus, so this will look very familiar from subsequent steps. And this is just a reference name. It can be kind of whatever you want. We'll choose that BI Services application pool. It just happens to be the first one in the list. And then we want to add that to the default proxy list, which means that as new objects are created, new sites are created, that by default they will have Excel Services added as a service they can use. Okay, so the application exists. So I'm just going to do those few little details that we talked about. So I'll click on Excel Services to configure it. And here within Application Settings, I'll just go ahead and put in my unattended service account. And then once I've got that in, I can just click OK. Now to change the workbook size and refresh warnings, those are in the Trusted File Locations area. So if I click in here, the Trusted File Locations by default essentially says trust everything from everywhere, and that's fine. You might decide that you want to have more control and you could modify this, but by default that's the setting that we get. And I'm just going to scroll down, change the maximum workbook size from 10 megabytes to something else. I'm going to say maybe 100 megabytes in my case. You can decide what number works for you. And then I'm going to turn off the refresh warning option. And you notice there are a lot of other settings that you can use in here. I'm going to leave the rest to their defaults. And then for my trusted data connection libraries, I'll click in here. And you notice there aren't any at first. So what I'm going to do is look up where mine is, because when I created the top level site, it created it for me. And where I'm going to put my data connections, and this is my choice, will be into this data connection library that was created for me. So I'll just copy from the URL bar that URL, click on Add Data Connection Library, paste in the location, and say this is the default. And then if I created subsites with new data connection libraries, I would have to come back in here and add those as well. And then finally, as far as configuration, I just need to make sure that Excel Services has the permission to pull data out of the content database. So I'll go back to the content database server, which is SPDB1, and look in the logins area and see whether it's here yet, and it is. So the service account running Excel Services is this one, Service SPBI. And if I bring that up and look at my user mapping, I can check whether it can read the content database or not. And it can't yet, so it can't really access the data. So if I tried to load Excel Services content, I would actually get errors because it can't do that. And I'm going to come in here and just mark that as a DB owner so that it can essentially do what it wants with this content. Click OK. So that will do it for permissions. And then always remember that just because you configure a service application doesn't mean it's actually started. So the last thing we'll need to do is go into the services on server settings, make sure we're on the application server where we're going to run that. And I'm actually not going to run this on app 1, I'm going to run this on app number 2. So if I go and find Excel Calculation Services, I can start that. Now of course you can run Excel Services on more than one server. You could run it on app 1 and on app 2. Now, that would also mean, however, that you need to configure both of them for like Kerberos delegation and so on. So what I'm doing is kind of keeping all of my BI services on app 2 and leaving app 1 just for kind of core SharePoint things. But it doesn't mean that I couldn't, do both, or if I was having a problem with app 2, maybe I would reconfigure app 1 to serve that role temporarily. You have the flexibility in the environment to do things kind of as you wish and run it the way you want. But this is how I'm going to do it. So then finally, let's kind of test it, make sure that things actually do work. And if I go into libraries, and documents has one item, the template actually loads in a very simple Excel Services workbook that we can use to make sure that it actually works at all. So I'll just click on that spreadsheet and see it come up, and as I interact with it, as long as I can see that it's actually changing as I click slicers and work with it, then I'm pretty sure that Excel Services is configured correctly, at least at the most basic level. And then to test here, I'll just click on a slicer, and I want to see the worksheet change, because if Excel Services is working, then I will have change as I click different slicers, and it looks like it is working just fine.